Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if something bad that happened in your life can truly change who you are, or if it is experiencing difficult emotions that make it feel that way? This new study dives deep into that question for people who have survived sexual assault. Today, we're looking at a fascinating study that asks a really important question about what happens after a deeply traumatic event like sexual assault. We know that for many survivors, the experience can leave lasting emotional scars. But what is the relationship between those painful feelings and how the event itself becomes a part of a person's identity? Does the event changing who you are lead to more distress, or does the distress make the event feel more central to your life? This study tried to figure out the direction of that connection. So the big question here is about cause and effect. When someone experiences a traumatic event, especially something as profound as sexual assault, two things often happen. First, they might develop post-traumatic stress symptoms, like intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, or feeling on edge. Second, the event itself might start to feel incredibly important, becoming a central part of their life story and how they see themselves. Think of event centrality as how much an event takes up space in your life's narrative. Does having a lot of these difficult feelings make the event feel more central to your identity? Or does the event being central to your identity cause those difficult feelings? That is what the researchers wanted to untangle. To tackle this, they gathered data from over 400 survivors of sexual assault. What is really cool about this study is that they didn't just ask people once. They checked in with these survivors at 3 different points in time, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months after they joined the study. This repeated measurement is key because it allows researchers to see how things change over time. And if one thing predicts another later on, they looked at 2 main things: how central the assault felt to their identity and life story, and how many post-traumatic stress symptoms they were experiencing. Now, how did they analyze this? They used something called a cross-legged panel model. Don't let the fancy name scare you. Imagine you have 2 things you are measuring over time. Let's call them A and B. A cross-legged model looks at how A at an earlier time point predicts B at a later time point, and how B at an earlier time point predicts A at a later time point. It is like looking at a tennis match where you are tracking both players' scores over several rounds to see if one player's performance in one round influences the other player's performance in the next. They also used a more advanced version of this model, the Random Intercept HLPM, which is super important because it helps separate differences that are stable for a person over time, like personality traits from temporary fluctuations. This is like saying, is it your baseline tendency for anxiety that affects your sleep, or is it a bad night's sleep that makes you more anxious that specific week? And here is what they found, which is pretty striking. When they looked at the data, the main connection they saw was that having higher post-traumatic stress symptoms earlier on predicted higher event centrality later on. This was true whether they looked at people's general tendencies between person effects or how fluctuations within a person changed over time within person effects. So, if someone was experiencing more distress, more intrusive thoughts, more avoidance, that seemed to make the traumatic event feel more central to their life story down the road. Interestingly, the researchers didn't find the reverse to be true. Higher event centrality early on didn't predict higher post-traumatic stress symptoms later on. It was primarily the distress that seemed to influence how central the event felt. They also did some extra digging, looking at whether it mattered how long it had been since the assault when people joined the study. While these specific findings weren't statistically strong enough to be declared definite, they hinted that the relationship might be a bit different depending on how soon after the trauma people were studied. This is an area for future research. So, what is the big takeaway here? The study strongly suggests that for survivors of sexual assault, it is the ongoing experience of post-traumatic stress symptoms that tends to drive the event becoming more central to their identity and life story. It is not so much that the event being central causes more distress, but rather that the distress keeps the event feeling very present and significant, weaving it into how people see themselves. This is a really important distinction because it means that focusing on reducing these symptoms, the actual pain and distress, might be the most effective way to help the event become less all-consuming in a person's life. If symptoms decrease, the event centrality might naturally decrease as a consequence. This is especially relevant given the high rates of PTSD after sexual assault. The introduction highlights just how common these difficulties are, with a significant percentage of survivors experiencing clinically significant symptoms even a year later. This underscores the need for effective interventions. The researchers define event centrality as how much an event becomes part of who you are. It is like a landmark in your life story that shapes how you see yourself and how you understand everything else that happens. If this landmark is a traumatic event, it can deeply affect your worldview. They point out that many studies have shown a link between event centrality and PTSS. But they say, when you look at studies that follow people over time, the results haven't always been clear about which comes first. This is where their study really shines by using a longitudinal design to examine the directional relationship. They further explain that not many studies have used the kind of rigorous cross-lagged analysis they employed, and when they have, the results have sometimes conflicted. This highlights the value of their approach in trying to settle this question. For example, some studies found centrality predicting symptoms, while others found the reverse. They mentioned that previous studies have used different statistical tools, some of which don't fully separate stable personality traits from day-to-day ups and downs, by using the right clear picture of how changes within a person over time related to each other. The introduction also brings up a crucial point. Sexual assault, being an interpersonal violation, has a particularly strong potential to be integrated into someone's identity. This is because it often shatters core beliefs about oneself and others, making it harder to process without it becoming a defining aspect of one's life. The method section tells us the study used data from a larger project called the Trust Study conducted in Norway. They used measurement points that were 3, 6, and 12 months after the participants joined the study. They focused on these 3 later points for their main analysis, because that is when they measured both the key things they were interested in, event centrality and post-traumatic stress symptoms. They recruited participants in a couple of ways through specialized centers and social media to try and get a good mix of people, including those who had sought help and those who hadn't. For measuring event centrality, they used a well-established scale that asks questions about how much the assault has become a reference point for understanding oneself and the world, if it is part of their identity, and if it was a turning point in their life. And for post-traumatic stress symptoms, they use the International Trauma Questionnaire, which assesses core symptoms of PTSD according to the latest diagnostic criteria. Remember that cross-lagged panel model the researchers used. They used 2 versions. One is the standard CLPM, which gives you an overall sense of the relationship between people. The other, the right CLPM, is more sophisticated. It is like having a microscope that lets them see how changes within the same person over time are related, separating that from just differences between people. This is crucial for getting closer to understanding cause and effect. They tested if the relationships between the variables change over the 9-month period they studied. The good news for simplicity was that the relationships seemed to stay pretty consistent. This means they could use a model where the connections were assumed to be the same over time, which makes the results easier to interpret. Looking at the results, particularly in Figure 1, we see the core findings for the traditional CLPM, which looks at overall patterns between people. They found a significant link from PTSS at an earlier time to centrality at a later time. The same was true for the Reichli LPM, which importantly looks at changes within a person. This means that when a person experienced higher PTSS at one point, their event centrality tended to be higher at the next point. In the CLPM, which is like looking at the overall trends across all participants, the results were clear. Higher post-traumatic stress symptoms at an earlier time point predicted higher event centrality at a later time point. This was a statistically significant finding indicated by that beta value and the confidence interval. But when they looked the other way, if earlier event centrality predicted later PTSS, that link wasn't significant. The really powerful part is the right CLPM. This model separates what is stable about a person from the day-to-day changes. And even when looking at those day-to-day changes, they found that an increase in post-traumatic stress symptoms within a person predicted an increase in how central the event felt at the next measurement point. Crucially, changes in how central the event felt did not predict subsequent changes in distress. This finding strongly suggests that the distress is the driver. They also conducted some exploratory analyses, looking at whether the timing of when people joined the study after their assault made a difference. They split the participants into those who joined within 6 months of their assault and those who joined later. This exploratory part of the study, while not definitive due to some limitations, showed something interesting. It suggested that for the within-person affects the changes, a person experiences the relationship might be different depending on how soon after the trauma they were studied. In the more recently exposed group, the numbers hinted that event centrality might be more predictive of subsequent PTSS. But in the group that was further out from their trauma, the pattern reversed, with PTSS looking more predictive of centrality. While they say these weren't statistically significant, this descriptive difference is a clue worthy of further investigation with more participants. It hints that the pathway might evolve over time. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. One big one is that the sample was mostly young, Norwegian women. This means we need to be careful about applying these findings directly to other groups like men or people from different cultural backgrounds, or those with immigration histories. Another important point is that this was an observational study. While the sophisticated statistical models they used get us closer to understanding cause and effect, they can't definitively prove causality. There could still be other factors not measured in the study that are influencing these relationships. They also didn't have information about participants' mental health history before the assault or if they had experienced other traumas. These pre-existing factors could certainly influence how someone processes a new trauma and how central it becomes to their identity. And a final limitation they mention is that they started measuring event centrality at wave 2, so their analysis focused on the 3-month to 12-month mark. They didn't have baseline centrality data from right after the event, which could have provided even more insight into the very early dynamics. Scroll conclusion in conclusion. The present study indicates that the longitudinal relationship between post-traumatic stress and event centrality among sexual assault survivors is predominantly symptom-driven, suggesting that high levels of distress play a primary role in weaving the trauma into an individual's identity over time. In conclusion, to wrap it all up, this study gives us a really clear picture. For survivors of sexual assault, the distress they experience seems to be the driving force that makes the traumatic event a central part of their identity and life narrative. This means that interventions focused on reducing those painful symptoms might be the most effective route to helping survivors heal and move forward, potentially leading to a natural decrease in how central the trauma feels over time. It suggests that trying to directly change how central the event is might not be as effective as addressing the symptoms that make it feel so significant in the first place. The exploratory findings are super interesting because they suggest that the relationship might change over time, especially in the early stages after a trauma. And this is an area that definitely needs more research. Future studies with larger groups of people who are studied very early after their trauma could really shed light on how these connections evolve. This research is a powerful reminder of the complex ways trauma affects us, and it offers valuable insights for therapists and survivors alike, guiding us toward more effective paths of healing. What are your thoughts on this research? Does this resonate with your understanding of how difficult experiences impact us? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this explanation helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more insights into the human mind, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching.